It's just a couple of minutes past 2 o'clock. Let's start our session.
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on New Zealand visas and visas for New Zealanders. My name is Lillian Ajuria. I am one of the partners at Ajuria Lawyers. I can see a lot of familiar names attending today, so welcome everyone. Also on the webinar is Ron Kessels, another partner in the firm, and today we have the pleasure of having Karen Justice. For those of you who don't know Karen, she's one of our other Karens. We've got another two in the office. Karen Justice and her team run our New Zealand practice, and Viviana is also online, who's part of Karen's team. Their contact details are at the end of the slides on the webinar, so you'll have an opportunity to jot them down if you don't already have them. Of course, as with every webinar, we do have to give you a disclaimer. This webinar is only for general information and it's not intended as legal advice on any particular matters. The webinar today is obviously very timely given the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinta Ardern yesterday had a meeting with Australia's National Cabinet to discuss the possibility of this concept of the trans-Tasman bubble. So we will touch on that today. Obviously, both countries have been very successful in slowing the spread of the virus, and we were just saying to Karen before we joined the webinar that it's a big congratulations to New Zealand that they've had such low numbers over the last few days. Ron, if you don't mind moving to the other slide, I'll just quickly touch on what topics we will cover today. Obviously, we will talk about these border restrictions and going into New Zealand and what it's mean for temporary visa holders and for workers of companies. We'll talk about visa processing and what the New Zealand government is doing at the moment. We'll deal with the delays of processing and where to from here. Towards the end of the webinar, we will also answer whatever questions you post. You will have on your screen a Q&A facility that Andrea just mentioned. So any questions that you have throughout the webinar, please feel free to pop them up there and we'll try and get to all of them towards the end or as we go over today. So I'll pass it on to Karen now and you can take it from there.
Thanks, Lillian and Ron. Hi, everybody. As Lillian explained, I look after Ajuria's New Zealand business and look forward to getting to know you all over the coming months. So we thought it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about New Zealand. I know that a lot of you have staff in New Zealand and some may come between Australia and New Zealand. Obviously, in normal circumstances, it's not such a big deal, particularly for Australian citizens and resident visa holders, but we're not in normal times. So we have had our border closed essentially since the 19th of March. This covers all arrivals, so people that come by sea and by air, and including super yachts. There was some confusion to start with, and super yachts continued to arrive. But after the closure, this was quickly shut down by the government. So we have a group of exclusions to our border restrictions. So those people do not need to apply for an exemption. Essentially, it's a very small group: New Zealand citizens, New Zealand resident and permanent resident visa holders. So unlike Australia, we have both resident and permanent resident visas. Suffice to say, they both allow, they're both similar to Australia's permanent resident visas, except that our permanent resident visa has no resident return visa, so people can hold that visa indefinitely even if they're not in New Zealand. With regards to Australian citizens and resident visa holders, they are only allowed to come into New Zealand without prior approval if they're normally resident in New Zealand. So this is really important. If they can't show that they were resident in New Zealand before the closures, they will not be permitted entry to New Zealand in the exemption. So something just to be wary of. We did have a situation with a worker who was a UK national, and we had got him a visa and he came, and his Australian citizen wife remained overseas to tidy up affairs, and in the meantime the border shut. Because she's not normally resident in New Zealand, we're unable to get her into the country. We have a mandatory quarantine process, so everybody, and that includes New Zealand citizens or residents, must be quarantined for 14 days on arrival. Now, for a while, we had self-isolation, but the government decided that they needed to up the ante on that again, and so the government is currently paying for all arrivals to be put up in designated hotels in either Auckland or Christchurch, depending on their port of entry, for 14 days, and everything is paid for. So at this stage, there's no charge to the individual or employer or back to anyone else. Interesting to note, Wellington also has an international airport, but for the time being, that's been closed for arrivals from overseas for passengers, at least anyway. Lillian, does that...
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting comment that Australian citizens or permanent residents, in order to travel to New Zealand, they would have to show that they're resident there, that they've got a residence set up. It's the same as New Zealanders coming into Australia. So unless a New Zealander already has a residence set up here, they won't be able to get an exemption to come in. They would have to apply for a waiver from the Australian Border Force Commissioner. Whilst the seminar really is not on the Australian border limitations, I'll just quickly mention a couple of updates that we had late yesterday afternoon on waivers and temporary visa holders coming into Australia. It's very clear here, and I know that you, Karen, you will touch on what the numbers are like in New Zealand. We don't have any statistics here. They haven't been released. And from what we hear, they won't be released for some time, but the numbers are extremely low. They're taking 2 to 3 weeks to process any waiver applications coming into Australia, and most of them are being refused. At the moment, the only exemptions are still the same, that they haven't changed. Basically, if you've got an Australian partner or children, you're invited by the government for the purposes of assisting in a COVID-19 response, or those who would be in the national interest. Those who work in critical medical services, including air, ambulance, delivery of supplies. Those who have critical skills, medical specialists, engineers, marine pilots and crew, diplomats, and then other humanitarian compassionate grounds. The limitations, the exceptions are very, very limited. The update that we received from the Australian government late yesterday afternoon is that anyone coming into Australia on an employment basis, because the sponsor really needs them to be here, will need to provide a letter from the employer sponsor, and that letter will have to cover a number of issues, but one of them being that the employer sponsor will be responsible financially for any costs incurred by the relevant state where the person travels to during the 14-day quarantine period. So unlike New Zealand, the Australian government is now passing on the cost to employers to cover any expenses incurred while the person was in quarantine for the 14 days. So it's not so similar to New Zealand, but a little bit different in terms of the cost. Already the government's talking about passing that on and making employers responsible for it.
Thanks, Lillian. Yeah, it's interesting. The two countries are sort of working to the same goal, obviously, and getting there, just slight variations on the theme. So our exemption process is an online registration process, first up. So it's like what we call an expression of interest. And that's a very simple form that somebody completes. And then a decision is made within 48 hours by Immigration New Zealand, normally on the same day, as to whether the person is allowed to make an application for a visa or to have their existing visa conditions waived to allow them to come in. And then once the applicant has been advised that their expression of interest has been approved, the visa application is made, and the decision on that is pretty quick. I think they're averaging about a 4 to 5 day turnaround time. Yeah, so they're pretty quick. The groups that are permitted under the exemption are partners and dependent children of New Zealand citizens and resident visa holders, Australian citizens and permanent resident visa holders who are normally resident in New Zealand. those who've got critical purpose to be in New Zealand, and they're defined as essential health workers, other essential workers, New Zealand-based partners and children of work or student visa holders, and critical humanitarian travel. So we have Samoan and Tongan citizens, for example, who may need to come for healthcare. They would come under the humanitarian travel. There's a really high level of decline, as you can imagine. In particular, those with the highest decline rate are those that fall into the other essential workers category. They have a 2% approval rate only. And essentially, Immigration New Zealand have advised that the person would need ministerial approval in order to get any kind of exemption to come in. So there's been a lot of businesses and employers saying, but our person is essential, but they're not a health worker. There was, I think, the only group of people who have been given that exemption who weren't health workers were a group of German engineers who were desperately needed in Wellington to fix the pipes, the wastewater pipes that Wellington has a bit of an issue with at the moment. Overall, as of these figures are as of the end of last week, they had Immigration New Zealand received just under 6,000 requests for exemptions. They had decided almost all of those, 5,800, and only 1,231 exemptions were granted. Excuse me. So you can see by that that they really are very focused on only allowing those into the country that are deemed necessary. Immigration New Zealand, interestingly, even though they've been closed, they have continued to receive applications. So I might talk about that a little bit later on, actually. Thanks, Ron. I'm ready to
yeah, thank you both. So Ron here, just one final comment, I guess, before we move on. You would have heard in the news in the last few days about ongoing discussions between Australia and New Zealand, with some likelihood that this Australia-New Zealand bubble might be, they might come up with a solution there for travel. We'll be watching that really carefully, and we'll come back to you as soon as we have any information on that. I think for all of us, that's going to be interesting, not only just for moves between New Zealand and Australia, but just to understand how travel might be dealt with going forward, because there's discussions also going on with Singapore and other countries. So I think that's going to be a very interesting development. And I think Lillian yesterday, the indication was that they thought that could be as soon as a month away. Without
they're talking about a few weeks, and interestingly, it's Qantas and the Sydney Airport Authority that initiated the discussions, but now it's at the Prime Minister level with both countries. And as it was in the news yesterday, it does sound like it's going to be a real possibility. So New Zealand will be the first country, and we're watching the space very carefully, but it sounds like we will have the travel bans for quite some time into Australia, and then it will be lifted on a country by country basis. That's how it's looking at the moment. And I would imagine New Zealand would be the same.
Yes, I think they are looking at country by country, and at least until there is a vaccine available or a cure, I think they are looking at the source country and whether the situation is under control there or not. Thanks, Ron. So visa processing. I'm sure all of you are aware, but so we've got several different types of work visas in New Zealand. There is essential skills work visa, which is a labour market tested work visa category and is by far and above the most common type of work visa that people get for New Zealand. Those who are accredited employers are able to secure work to residence or talent visas for their staff, and that has a direct pathway to residence. And those two categories would make up the employer-related work visas. Of course, we also have a large population of working holiday makers, similar to Australia. partners who are given full work rights, similar to Australia, and various other visa categories that allow some type of work rights, such as students. So unlike Australia, Immigration New Zealand has been effectively closed since the 23rd of March, when we went into level 4 lockdown. There have been some staff working, but this has been a really small number. They've been focused on urgent visa applications under the border exception process. We've had all of the offices, visa processing offices closed, and they continue to be closed. There was an expectation, or maybe more of hope, that they would return to work after we came into level 3 last week, but that hasn't eventuated. So what they have done in the interim is they've suspended some groups of residence application processes, which is making some people rather nervous, to say the least. They need to, so we have a what's called an epidemic management notice in force at the moment, and that gives the government, not only in terms of immigration, but wide ranging government related services, it allows them to do a number of things. And one of them is to suspend parts of the visa processing, but it can only be for a maximum of 6 months. So the residence processes that have been suspended for now are the expressions of interest for skilled migrant category applications. Now this is our main points tested residence process. Some of you may have staff going through that process. Applications that are lodged because Immigration New Zealand is closed have not been processed, but they can still submit an expression of interest, and normally these are drawn out every 2 weeks, but that has not happened since mid-March, and we don't have a date for when that process will start up again. Also affected is the long anticipated parent category draws for expressions of interest. So this category was shut in late 2016 and finally reopened and relaunched in February of this year, and the first draw, if you like, for the expression of interest was due to take place in May. That's been suspended again, so we're just sort of left hanging there a little bit. The other things that have been affected are registrations for Pacific Access category and Samoan quota, which applications which relate to New Zealand's Pacific responsibilities there. They've also suspended 19 capped working holiday visa schemes that were due to open from dating back from March through for a 6-month period. This doesn't include working holiday schemes from the UK, from Canada, US or Germany. None of those schemes are capped, and therefore they are still open. People can make applications for them online, but with Immigration New Zealand staff not processing applications, and of course travel to New Zealand is difficult, the visa might not necessarily be granted anytime soon, but the schemes themselves are not closed. So under the epidemic management notice that I mentioned earlier, all temporary visa holders who were onshore and who had visas expiring between the 2nd of April and the 9th of July inclusive have had their visas automatically extended until late September. It's the 25th of September. So this means that if somebody was here on a 2-week visitor visa and got stuck here, they're now valid. They're able to stay legally until the 25th of September. Working holiday visas, these have also been extended, so everything. And importantly to note, particularly for employers, is that people's work rights on those working holiday visas have also been extended. So for example, UK nationals, if they were coming up to their 12 months, completion of their work, ability to work, they can continue working as needed or if available. There's been some concessions that have been granted automatically, and some that just have a process that needs to to be followed on the Immigration New Zealand's website, but those that would be of interest to employers in particular are those who have work visa holders and are working in essential services as defined on MB's website. So there is a list, for those of you familiar with the operations in New Zealand, there's a list of businesses and services that are categorised as essential for the purposes of our level 4 and level 3 alert levels. So people working who already have work visas in those services can change their role, or they can work for a different employer in the same region through a special variation of condition process, and that can be done without any fee, and it's a almost like a registration process by the employer. That dispensation allows the worker to vary their work conditions for whilst we are in level 3 and level 4 alert, and also for the following 6 weeks. After that time, their original work visa conditions will revert. There's been changes to the healthcare industry, so those who work in the lower skilled occupations, in particular the aged care industry, they're able to gain an additional 12 months low skilled work visa. So what happens normally is someone can only have a maximum of 3 12-month low skilled work visas before they're required to spend 12 months outside of New Zealand. So that rules, or those rules, have been in place for coming up to 3 years now, and so the government realised that we were about to lose a whole lot of aged care workers in the coming couple of months. So they have taken action to allow that group of people to have a further 12-month visa, which is great. They do not need to go. And finally, student visa holders working in healthcare industry as of the 3rd of April 2020 have had their 20 hours a week maximum restriction lifted, and that remains in force until the 3rd of July. Thanks, Ron. So, needless to say, widespread closures and border restrictions are causing significant delays. All Immigration New Zealand offices are closed, both in New Zealand and offshore. So over the last 2 years, Immigration New Zealand have been in the process of onshoring, if you like, their visa processing, but there remains a handful of offices offshore who deal with specific types of applications and also risk and verification services. The biggest one of those is Beijing, and that normally does about 10,000 temporary applications a week, mostly visitor visas for those offshore, but also some student and work visas. So that Beijing office has been closed since Chinese New Year in January. It closed for Chinese New Year, and then it's never reopened. None of the other offices are open. They are monitoring that daily, we've been told, but obviously they're not only subject to restrictions imposed by the New Zealand government, but also the conditions in each country. The net effect has meant that a lot of people have been left hanging, in particular those who are offshore. We have a large number of work visa applicants who are waiting offshore, had their visa applications in process, or even some that had just been approved but hadn't yet travelled to New Zealand, and are now unable to. Immigration New Zealand are not treating offshore applications across the board, across all categories, in any priority at all. The rationale behind that is that even if they were to start processing offshore or applications from those offshore, the people won't be able to get through the border. So there's no point. They're trying to focus their attentions on sorting out the issues for people in New Zealand. As part of that, the Minister released a new priority order for application processing in mid-April. Not surprisingly, the top priority is for critical healthcare workers, so related work visas, and those for humanitarian needs. There's 4 tiers in total. Now, at the moment, because of the restricted staff at Immigration New Zealand offices, really only top priority applications are being processed. It's hoped that with the difficulty Immigration New Zealand have is, I guess they've been caught napping a little bit. They have very limited ability for staff to work remotely, and of course they're not allowed in the offices, so that's caused no end of issues. I understand that they are in the process of rolling out a new technology solution that will see more of their staff working from home with brand new laptops, but otherwise, yeah. Once more caseworkers do come on board and are able to start processing, we will look, we'll see visa applications in the 2nd tier coming, being finalised. Those are for fee-paying students. Mostly, or again, all of these are onshore. So foreign fee-paying students, partners of New Zealand citizens and residents, partners and dependent children of work or student visas, and post-study work visas. So these are people who have completed qualifications in New Zealand, now eligible for a work visa up to 3 years, depending on the length and level of study that they have done. So again, that tier all for onshore people already. We finally get to the 3rd tier where work visas are sitting. But within that group, those who are offshore have been prioritised last. The 4th tier includes other kinds of temporary applications, which would be visitor visas, and all residence applications. So residence really has sort of dropped right down to the bottom, unfortunately, particularly for those offshore. Thanks, Ron. So where do we go from here? As Ron said to start with, we have had a couple of days, New Zealand this week, with 0 new cases. So we're feeling pretty chuffed with ourselves on that one. Today we were back to 2 new cases, unfortunately, but that's okay. It's all heading in the right direction, as is Australia. So yesterday, a new act was tabled in Parliament, and under great deal of urgency. It's an amendment to the Immigration Act that we work under, and it will provide discretion to the Minister of Immigration to make some broad decisions on groups of applications and applicants for the next 12 months. It's being done under immense speed. The first reading was yesterday, and we have go through from there. It's a select committee discussion. Then it is a 2nd reading in Parliament and a vote, and then a 3rd reading, and then it has royal assent and signed off. So they're hoping to go through that process with the bill taking effect on the 15th of May, which is the end of next week. At the moment, there is not a lot of information coming out of Immigration New Zealand about what that will entail. They're pretty wide-reaching powers, and just watching that with a degree of anxiety. It's likely to, Immigration have provided some information or some examples where it could be to relax employment conditions. So for some of your staff, it may allow your staff to, as a blanket rule for people on work visas restricted to employer or location or occupation or all 3, it may waive some of those or all of those conditions for a period of time. But I just stress that that's just an example that's been given. We will keep you updated on that, but for now, it's something to watch. Like Australia and every other country around the world, there's going to be some severe labour market implications. We've already heard from Immigration New Zealand that they are concerned that the labour market is going to look significantly different once we come out of this than before we went in. It may well have implications for those who have labour market tested work visa applications lodged but not yet decided. So, for example, the essential skills work visa categories, there has been discussion, although nothing's been confirmed, that it could immigration may require new labour market testing to be undertaken before they finalise the visa. We're just not sure about that at the moment. Immigration are scrambling to try and kind of work out how to, what issue they need to tackle first. So, but just a heads up, nothing's been confirmed, but they have mentioned on several occasions their concern. And of course, we have a Labour government here, which is very focused on New Zealanders first for jobs.
So Karen, can I just jump in there? Interesting point about labour market testing, and perhaps where Australia and New Zealand will follow each other a little bit, the same as we have in the past. But right now, that is becoming a sizable issue here in Australia as well, and we're noticing it now already in processing of applications. So where lodged permanent residence applications are being looked at, we're being asked for confirmation that the position is in fact still there. There's talk about having to show additional testing of the market, or how you have since 1 March essentially retested, although it's not as strict as formal labour market testing, but basically the same point, which is that as unemployment rises or is high, we're expecting here to have quite significant additional requirements around proving the need for an overseas person, and similarly with your comments in relation to processing, I don't know how you're seeing it there, but the Australian government has now announced, or is starting to talk about, quite significant cuts in the total number of visas for next year and migration for next year. So what we anticipate will happen, as it has in the past, is quite a lot of delays in relation to processing to try and slow down the numbers. I'm just interested whether you're hearing any of that. Well, clearly some of it in labour market, but whether you might anticipate similar things there. Here it works very much on a priority processing system, as you know, and it's quite simple to lower the numbers. You just delay processing. So yeah, I'm just interested for your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the current government came into power coming up to 3 years ago on the promise that they would curtail immigration, and there was a large degree of angst amongst employers and businesses, as you can imagine. So they kind of backtracked a little bit from it in a formal way. But what they've been doing essentially over the last 18 months or so is slowing down the processing of a lot of applications, including residents. And the skilled migrant category that I mentioned earlier, our points tested residents system, because we don't have an employer sponsored residents category. The numbers are down 30%. In terms of approvals before we got to this stage now. And part of me can't help think, but, part of the suspension of the processing of those for onshore applicants is more about managing the numbers downwards than actually looking at whether, they could process those applications and get them out of the system. I think we will definitely see more focus on restricting the numbers of both temporary and residents. But the question's been asked. Our government has come out and said that they would, that they're hoping to kickstart a lot of infrastructure projects once we come out of this, to kickstart the economy again. And of course, we don't necessarily have all the labour for that. And with the borders shut, it's going to be sort of self-limiting.
Thanks. On that point, I just have another quick quick question. Are employers and businesses starting to get a little bit nervous that the rules might change a little bit to make it a little bit harder to sponsor people, and therefore perhaps considering lodging applications now in order to avoid any potential changes so that they're protected if that does happen?
Yeah, absolutely. We are seeing some applications certainly being brought forward and having it lodged in the system. There's some complications in that, you know, people might not necessarily be able to do a medical exam or get a police clearance certificate. So we're seeing a significant number of the applications that are being lodged are incomplete. But immigration, I think, have acknowledged that that's just a symbol of the time. So I do think there is a certain level of merit in getting applications in before we have any widespread changes, in particular with this new bill coming in that, you know, we'll wake up one day and the minister's decided that there are no more work visa applications for 3 weeks or whatever it is.
Yeah, so we're starting to see that a little bit here as well in Australia, where because of unemployment and because of this push even from the Labor Party now of jobs for Australians first, employers are starting to worry about potential changes and occupations being removed from the sponsorship list. So we're starting to sort of see this sort of, you know, maybe given that we know applications will not be refused if they're not complete. If there's health or character missing, the department will just pause on any processing. So talk is, well, let's get a lodge, get it into the system, and if something does change, then at least these employees are protected, and they're not subject, they're not disadvantaged by any changes to the legislation. So it's interesting that I think probably New Zealand will follow suit as well.
I believe so, yeah, absolutely. Or, you know, we are seeing some, probably more so on the resident side at this stage, because I think a lot of employers are still wondering and figuring out whether they are going to need people or what their workforce is going to look like coming out of it, or whether they're even going to survive this time. But I have no doubt that, yeah, and you know, certainly talking to employers where they're thinking about somebody, we've said, look, put the application in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Oops, I think I've gone to the wrong, sorry, Ron, can you go back? I thought I'd finished, I hadn't. Yes, so sorry, that conversation, we were talking about labour market implications. Border restrictions, you know, we've touched on, but they are, the government here is talking about long-term restrictions, 12 to 18 months sort of minimum, although nothing is set in stone, obviously. It's good. There are conversations absolutely between Australia and Singapore and New Zealand. And I think, as we were talking about earlier, I think we can see that there is likely to be a definite easing of restrictions between Australia and New Zealand, hopefully in the not too distant future. I see our friend Winston Peters this morning came out and said that New Zealanders will be able to fly to Tasmania, and he's got the Tasmanian Premier on board in terms of accepting flights between the two. So that's got everyone quite excited. I think is the in Australia, are they? Has there been much discussion?
Yeah, I think the airline is excited. Yeah. The airline's like, well, the airline. Qantas is excited. Yeah, and they're obviously talking as well about states lifting their borders, because at the moment you can't, unless you've got an exemption, you can't even fly interstate. So that
right.
might change first. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we're unable to fly around domestically either, or travel by road long distances. So yeah. But in all, I think a very changed landscape going forward, that's for sure. but not, you know, our two countries are not the only ones affected. So yeah, I think that's all I had to say at this point, but very happy to take questions.
Thanks for that, Karen. I had a really quick question, I guess. In Australia, we are already seeing applications for waivers for the travel ban. So applications to the Australian Border Force Commissioner for employees to be allowed to come in. And it does seem like anything involved with infrastructure and engineering or construction are getting they're the ones that are going to be considered more closely. So I'm wondering, you did mention that earlier before about the German engineers for that Wellington project. So I'm wondering whether that is the same, given that the New Zealand government has indicated that to kickstart the economy, it's going to be very much reliant on infrastructure projects, and that's how they're hoping to create employment there.
Yeah, I think we will see first and foremost the parameters around what the border exemption process looks like, and who's able to gain access through that system will be broadened, and I will. I'm pretty confident that given the government's focus on infrastructure projects, that the relevant engineers, construction workers potentially will be, particularly for key roles, would be first looked at in terms of perhaps outside of essential services or healthcare workers as an occupational group to, you know, possibly have access to them, because we just don't have enough. We didn't have enough before we got hit, so we're not going to have enough going forward either. I think, is Australia looking at the occupation group, or is it just a general case by case?
So Australia has interestingly identified obviously medical professionals, but they have identified engineers in the travel ban waiver. So they have referred to that profession. So we are yet to find out whether that extends to other professions, you know, like a project manager or other professions within sort of that industry, and not just engineers. But clearly the Australian government is the same as New Zealand, identified infrastructure and construction projects as the main drivers to kickstart the economy. And hence, given the skill shortage, they have recognised that those roles are really significant and important. So they will let them in with that undertaking from the employer that we mentioned before, in relation to covering the cost for the quarantine period. Yeah. So engineers have been specifically mentioned.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I'm sure that we'll probably look at that. You know, we tend to follow what Australia does, just a few months or years behind, I think.
So we have a question from Rebecca in the Q&A. Rebecca's asking what the current position of immigration, I guess this is referring to Australia. So what is the current position of immigration if someone can't leave Australia due to no flights and the visa's expiring and we can't get a new one? So unlike New Zealand, as we just heard from Karen, New Zealand has done an automatic extension for visas. Australia hasn't done that. So the government is expecting that if someone's visa is expiring and they can't get a flight, they will need to apply for something else. There's no excuse for people to become unlawful or to let their visa cease to be in effect. And for that reason, there is different options depending on the person's circumstances. So definitely the person must apply for a new visa. It may be a bridging visa on the basis of future departure. They're being granted with no problem. It may be a tourist visa, or depending on the occupation or whether they need to work or what they do, it may be one of the new visas that have been created for this COVID-19, but they're very limited at the moment. So the answer, Rebecca, is that there's an expectation from the government that the person will not stay unlawful after the visa expiry, and that they will apply for something to make sure that the status is lawful until such time they can get a flight out of Australia. And I would imagine the same, Karen, in New Zealand. So the government doesn't want anybody to become unlawful. So there's an expectation for visas that haven't been automatically renewed, that they would apply for something.
Yes, absolutely. Although they do recognise that some people, particularly visitors who hadn't really intended on being here for very long and whose visas were due to expire before the 2nd of April, so particularly those around the mid to late March, that some people will have inadvertently become unlawful, and they've put in a process by which those people can email through to immigration, and it's one of the services that they are actually looking at and getting people back on their valid visas. But there's quite a lot of flexibility in terms of, you know, I guess once people lodge an online visitor visa extension, for example, they are granted what we call interim visas, which are the same as your bridging visas. So that preserves the person's legal status while they're waiting for their visa to be processed. But yeah, it's a real problem with people not necessarily happy to stay either, you know, would really like to go home but just can't get on a flight.
Yeah.
I was talking to someone the other day actually from the UK, and she said that they were hoping to get on a flight, but the British government put on a repatriation flight, and you know there was 400 and odd something places, and it was filled within a matter of minutes. So yeah, it's pretty hard.
Yeah. We've seen that a lot everywhere, haven't we? Yeah. So I don't think we've got any other questions or comments. That's fabulous, Karen. Thank you very much, and for Viviana, who's part of your team, who's also online. Thank you both for all your help in looking after our clients so well doing their New Zealand work. If anybody on the webinar has any questions, please feel free to contact Karen directly in relation to New Zealand. Any questions relating to Australia, you can come to us. Obviously, as we have updates, we'll let you know, and we will probably repeat a New Zealand webinar over the coming weeks. They're all advertised on our website, just on the front page, and we are continuing to still hold webinars every week for employers and employees, just with the latest update with the government. We have a webinar tomorrow afternoon, which is specifically for employees, and it will be on citizenship. What we have seen over the last couple of weeks is that people who are permanent residents, that they have become increasingly nervous about the status in Australia and the current world affairs. So we are seeing a lot of people interested in citizenship. So we are holding a webinar tomorrow. So if you've got any employees that may be interested, please do let them know. They're all free, so there's no cost involved. I think the latest update we had this morning is that we've got about 180 people already registered to attend that webinar tomorrow. If you have any questions about it, it's on the front page of our website, and the link is there to register. Other than that, thank you everybody for attending today. Stay safe, stop the spread, and stay positive. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone.